My boss said we have a meeting. I didn't expect it to be the one that changes everything. The morning had started like any other. The hum of fluorescent lights, the soft click of keyboards, and the low murmur of conversations created a rhythm I had grown used to. Yet when my phone buzzed with a message from my boss, I felt a curious jolt, half anticipation, half unease. I unlocked the screen to see her words. "We have a meeting." Just 6 simple words, but in them, there was a weight I couldn't ignore. It wasn't unusual for her to call a meeting without warning. She had that rare kind of presence, a quiet authority that commanded attention even without raising her voice. But something in the timing, the casual certainty of her message, stirred something in me I hadn't quite acknowledged before. My pulse ticked a little faster, a tiny thrill running beneath my calm exterior. I pushed back my chair and stood, letting my fingers trail over the smooth surface of my desk. The office smelled faintly of coffee and paper, a comforting blend that always seemed to anchor me. Yet, amidst the familiar scents, I could almost imagine her, the faint, elegant hint of her perfume that lingered wherever she went. I shook the thought away, focusing instead on the practical. What could this meeting be about? As I walked through the office, I noticed small details I usually overlooked. The sunlight filtered through the blinds in sharp, diagonal lines, dust motes dancing lazily in the golden shafts. My colleagues moved with the quiet efficiency of routine, but my attention kept drifting. I imagined her at her desk, papers neatly stacked, hair pulled back just so, the faintest crease of concentration between her brows. She always had a way of making the simplest gestures, adjusting a pen, leaning against her chair, look effortless, commanding. I tried to focus on my own work, tapping at the keyboard, answering emails, but the thought of the meeting tugged at the edges of my mind. There was something in the anticipation, the unknown, that made my senses sharper. I noticed the hum of the air conditioning, the soft squeak of a chair down the hall, the distant laughter of someone on a phone call. Everything seemed amplified, heightened, as if the office itself were holding its breath along with me. And then I realized, it wasn't just curiosity. There was an almost imperceptible flutter in my chest, a quiet awareness of her presence even when she wasn't in the room. I had admired her for months, her confidence, the graceful way she handled everything, the subtle kindness that peeked through when she thought no one was looking. But now, with this simple message, the anticipation became something more, a gentle pull I couldn't ignore. By the time I reached the door to the meeting room, my hands were slightly clammy, my heart a little louder in my chest. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of expectation, of possibility. The door loomed ahead, unassuming yet somehow charged, as if it held more than just a routine discussion. This is the real one, I thought, almost unconsciously, and for the first time, I realized that something about this ordinary morning might change everything. I pushed open the meeting room door, expecting the usual sterile setup, the long table, a few chairs, perhaps a laptop left open. But instead there she was. My boss, casually leaning against the table, arms crossed, a faint, knowing smile playing on her lips. The way she stood, effortless yet commanding, made the room feel smaller, warmer, somehow more intimate. My heart did a little flip, the kind that caught me off guard. Her gaze met mine almost immediately, sharp and observant, yet softened by a hint of amusement. There was no pretense in her expression, no formal authority demanding attention. It was simply her, and somehow, that made everything feel heavier with unspoken meaning. My first thought, unbidden, slipped into my mind: this is the real one. The words weren't just about the meeting, they were about her, about the way her presence seemed to pull the air closer, make the world sharper and slower all at once. I stepped inside, careful not to rush, letting my eyes take in the details I often missed. The sunlight slanting through the blinds caught her hair, turning strands of chestnut into flickers of gold. Her hand rested lightly on a stack of papers, fingers moving almost imperceptibly, brushing the edges in a gesture that seemed casual yet deliberate. The quiet rhythm of her breathing, the subtle weight of her stance, even the soft click of her shoes on the floor as she shifted slightly, all of it became magnified, filling the room with a tension I couldn't name. I swallowed and offered my usual polite greeting, but the words felt ordinary, flat against the electric charge in the air. She tilted her head, one eyebrow arched slightly, as if she could read the storm of thoughts behind my calm exterior. The smile didn't vanish, it lingered, gentle but knowing, and I felt a strange mix of embarrassment and fascination. My pulse quickened, subtle warmth creeping into my chest. Every fiber of my attention seemed glued to her. She gestured for me to sit, her movement fluid, unhurried, and I realized how unusual it was to feel so keenly aware of someone in a professional setting. Normally, meetings were mundane, predictable. But now, every glance, every shift of her posture carried weight. I noticed the soft crease at the corner of her eyes, the way her lips curved when she spoke, the faint, lingering scent of her perfume that seemed to wrap around me without her even moving. We started the meeting, talking about reports, deadlines, and projects, but I could barely focus. I found myself noticing the little things, how her voice dipped slightly when she emphasized a point, the gentle brush of her hand as she passed me a pen, the subtle warmth radiating from her presence as she leaned closer to point at a document. Each moment was ordinary on the surface, yet charged with something unspoken, a quiet connection, a pull that neither of us named but both acknowledged. When the meeting officially began, it felt as though time had stretched. The office noises, the hum of computers, even the distant chatter of colleagues faded into the background. It was just us in the room, and for the first time, I realized how deeply I had been aware of her, even before this encounter. And in that suspended, electrified space, I couldn't help but think again, almost in awe, this is the real one. By mid-morning, the tension from the earlier encounter had begun to settle, replaced by a lighter, almost mischievous energy. The meeting had ended, or at least the formal part of it, and we lingered in the conference room, surrounded by the hum of computers and the faint scent of fresh coffee lingering in the air. She was leaning slightly against the edge of the table again, arms crossed loosely, but this time there was a softness to her posture, a quiet invitation in the way she looked at me. "Did you really need 15 slides for that report?" she teased, her voice warm, edged with amusement. I laughed, a little embarrassed, but it felt genuine, lightening the weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying since entering the room. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the conversation became more than words. It was an exchange of glances, subtle smiles, and the kind of understanding that needed no explanation. As she handed me a folder, our fingers brushed briefly. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, but the sensation lingered. Her skin was soft, warm, and for a moment, I felt my pulse quicken, the familiar hum of tension threading through the air. I caught her subtle smile, one corner of her lips curving as if she knew exactly the effect she had on me. I tried to focus on the papers in my hands, but my awareness kept drifting back to her presence, the slight tilt of her head, the way sunlight streaked through her hair, catching flecks of gold in the strands. The banter continued naturally. She asked about my coffee preference, feigned surprise at my organizational habits, and lightly mocked my habit of keeping the same pen in my pocket for months. Every word, every small laugh, every glance built an intimacy that wasn't forced. It wasn't flirtation in the obvious sense, it was something deeper, subtler, rooted in the comfort and thrill of mutual recognition. I noticed the little gestures that made her human, approachable, and irresistibly graceful. The way she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear without thinking, the gentle rhythm of her breath as she listened to my responses, and the quiet steadiness in her voice that contrasted with the playful edge of her teasing. I could sense the vulnerability beneath her confidence, the softness she only let show in moments like this, when the room felt safe enough for it. Our conversation drifted naturally to weekend plans and favorite books. She leaned in slightly to point out a line in the report, her hand brushing mine once again, lingering just long enough to make me acutely aware of her warmth. I felt the tug of closeness, a quiet tension that threaded between us without a word, a pause that held more meaning than any sentence could. Every laugh, every shared observation, every small touch deepened the bond forming between us. By the time I left the meeting room, I felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and calm. The professional tension of the office had melted into something more personal, more intimate. I realized, with a quiet thrill, that the playful banter was only the beginning. Each glance, each small touch, each lingering moment was drawing us closer, threading an invisible line between us that neither of us had fully acknowledged, yet neither of us seemed eager to break. For the first time, I understood that the connection wasn't just about work. It was about noticing her, the subtle warmth in her presence, the way her laughter lingered, the quiet pull of something unspoken. And I knew, without needing to say it aloud, that this was only the start. It was one of those quiet afternoons when the office felt unusually still. The clatter of keyboards had faded to a distant hum, and most colleagues had left for the day. I found myself lingering near the balcony, stretching out my shoulders, when she appeared, unexpectedly calm, as if she had sensed I needed company. The sunlight painted the room in soft golds, casting long shadows, and for a moment, the outside world seemed to slip away. "Mind some company?" she asked softly, a subtle smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Her presence, always commanding, now felt gentle, almost tentative. I gestured for her to join me, and she leaned casually on the railing, the warmth of the late afternoon sun highlighting the subtle lines of experience on her face. I noticed the faint, comforting scent of her perfume mixed with the crisp air, an invisible tether drawing me closer without a word. The conversation started innocuously, small talk about work, deadlines, and the monotony of reports. But gradually, the tone shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if the quiet of the office encouraged honesty. She spoke of the pressures she faced, the constant balancing act of responsibility, expectations, and personal life. Her voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability tucked beneath each sentence, a faint tremor that made her seem both formidable and achingly human. I listened, feeling a mixture of admiration and empathy. It was rare to see someone so strong reveal their cracks, and even rarer to be trusted with them. When I spoke, I let myself open, sharing moments of doubt, the insecurities I usually kept buried beneath a calm exterior. She tilted her head slightly, listening intently, and I noticed the softening in her eyes, the subtle shift in her posture, as she offered silent understanding. At one point, she reached out, not deliberately, but naturally, her hand brushing mine as she adjusted the railing. The contact was fleeting, a mere graze, yet the warmth lingered. My pulse quickened, but it wasn't just attraction, it was a profound sense of connection. In that brief touch, I felt trust, recognition, and a quiet intimacy that transcended the usual boundaries of office decorum. We talked for what felt like hours, though in reality, only 20 minutes passed. Every word, every glance, every small gesture deepened a bond one hadn't anticipated. Her laughter, soft and genuine, broke the tension when I shared a slightly embarrassing story. Her smile, steady and encouraging, made the weight of her earlier confession feel lighter. There was a rhythm to our exchange, a balance of giving and receiving, of revealing and understanding. As the sun dipped lower, casting the city in shades of orange and pink, I realized the profound shift in our dynamic. What began as professional interaction had evolved into something intensely personal. The balcony, the fading light, the shared vulnerabilities, they had transformed the space into a quiet haven, where connection mattered more than hierarchy, and honesty mattered more than appearances. When we finally stepped back into the office, the ordinary world resumed its pace, but the air between us had changed. A subtle tension remained, but it was no longer just curiosity or admiration, it was intimacy, delicate yet undeniable. And in that moment, I knew our story had begun to deepen in a way that neither of us could ignore, a slow burn that would only grow brighter with each shared secret, each small, meaningful gesture. The office was nearly empty, the hum of computers and the distant shuffle of late working colleagues the only sounds around us. The formal meeting had ended hours ago, but neither of us seemed eager to leave. We lingered near the window, standing close enough that our shoulders brushed occasionally, each touch light yet loaded with an unspoken awareness. The late afternoon sun slanted in through the blinds, casting warm stripes across her hair and the polished surface of the table. It made everything feel softer, more intimate, as if the world itself had slowed to accommodate us. We talked quietly, our conversation meandering from work updates to more personal reflections. She leaned slightly toward me to point at a document, and the brief contact of her fingers against mine sent a small, unexpected warmth racing through me. It wasn't a deliberate touch, yet the intimacy of proximity made the moment electric. I caught her eyes, and in them, a faint spark lingered, an acknowledgement of something we hadn't named yet both understood. The subtle tension grew with each passing minute. Every laugh, every pause, every shared glance carried weight. I noticed the delicate way she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, the softness of her voice when she spoke, the steady rhythm of her breathing as she listened. I found myself aware of her presence in a way that went beyond admiration or curiosity. It was magnetic, pulling me into a space where only the two of us seemed to exist. She shifted closer to examine a graph on my laptop, her shoulder lightly pressing against mine. The contact was fleeting, yet I felt it linger in my chest, a warmth that made me acutely aware of her nearness. I realized then that these moments, quiet, unassuming, ordinary on the surface, were laden with meaning. The world outside the window, the hum of the office, the ticking of the clock, they all faded into the background. There was only this space, this closeness, this suspended pause where emotions floated between us unspoken but undeniable. We shared small jokes, smiles, and gentle teasing, each interaction drawing us subtly closer. When she laughed, I noticed how her eyes crinkled at the corners, how her hand briefly touched her chest, and how the sound resonated softly in the room. Each detail grounded me, made me more present, more aware of the growing connection between us. The playful tension from earlier had deepened into something more delicate, a quiet intimacy that was as comforting as it was thrilling. At one point, we both paused, the conversation trailing into silence. Her eyes met mine, and in that long, lingering gaze, I felt a world of unspoken thoughts and quiet understanding. It wasn't just attraction, it was a recognition of shared experience, of vulnerability, of a connection that transcended casual interaction. The brush of her hand, the closeness of our shoulders, the warmth of her presence, it all combined to create a moment that felt timeless, a suspended reality where nothing else mattered. When the moment finally ended, we stepped back from the window, the office returning to its usual rhythm. Yet the closeness remained, etched in the subtle tension that lingered in our glances, in the light touch of a shoulder, in the quiet smiles we exchanged. It was a connection that didn't need words, one that had been forged in the soft, intimate moments between tasks and deadlines. And I knew, with a quiet certainty, that this slow burn, unspoken closeness would shape everything that came next. It started as a routine afternoon, but the air between us was charged in a way that had been building for days. A miscommunication regarding a project report had left tempers frayed, not in anger but in frustration. We found ourselves alone in the conference room, the tension between us palpable. The usual office sounds, the hum of computers, distant footsteps, seemed muted, swallowed by the weight of unspoken emotions. Her eyes met mine immediately, steady and unwavering, but there was a sharpness there that hadn't been present before. "Why didn't you clarify the figures before sending the report?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. I felt a jolt, not from guilt, exactly, but from the intensity in her gaze. The usual professional tone of our exchanges now carried an edge, one that made my chest tighten. I took a slow breath, choosing honesty over excuses. "I thought I had double-checked everything," I admitted quietly, trying to match her calmness. "I didn't realize the mistake would be this noticeable." My words felt insufficient, yet necessary. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier, every sound amplified, the faint click of her pen, the shuffle of papers, the subtle shift in her stance as she leaned slightly closer. And then, something shifted. Her professional mask softened, revealing the vulnerability I had glimpsed before. She admitted, almost reluctantly, that she felt under pressure, that her expectations were high not just for the team but for herself. Her shoulders slumped slightly, her hands brushing the edge of the table. In that instant, I saw the woman behind the authority, the quiet fears, the self-imposed weight of responsibility. Without thinking, I stepped a fraction closer. "We're all human," I said softly. "Mistakes happen. It doesn't make you, or anyone, less capable." My voice carried more than reassurance. It carried sincerity, an attempt to bridge the space between professional boundaries and personal connection. Her gaze softened, the sharpness replaced with a flicker of appreciation and something unspoken, something tender. For a moment, silence hung between us, thick and electric. Then she moved slightly, her shoulder brushing mine as she leaned in to adjust a document. The contact was brief but lingering, a subtle acknowledgement of the trust and closeness that had been quietly building. I felt the warmth radiating from her, noticed the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the office air, and the familiar pull of attraction and connection surged quietly but undeniably. We both exhaled simultaneously, the tension dissolving into something fragile and intimate. The confrontation had brought honesty, yes, but also clarity, a shared understanding that our bond was more than work-related, that the moments of closeness and vulnerability weren't accidental. We had crossed an invisible threshold, acknowledging emotions neither of us had fully named, yet both recognized. When the meeting officially ended, we remained near the table for a heartbeat longer, eyes locking, smiles faint but meaningful. The emotional confrontation had shifted the dynamic between us. There was still hesitation, still the delicate balance of boundaries and desire, but now it carried warmth and recognition instead of uncertainty. And in that suspended moment, I realized that what we had was fragile yet undeniable, a slow-burning connection that had reached a turning point, ready to deepen in ways we couldn't yet predict. The office had emptied, leaving a quiet stillness that wrapped around us like a soft blanket. We lingered near the exit, either rushing to leave, as though the day had granted us a rare, private pause. The late evening sunlight spilled across the floor, turning the room into shades of gold and amber. I noticed the way it touched her hair, illuminating each chestnut strand, and felt a gentle warmth settle in my chest, part admiration, part something more tender, intimate. We walked toward the door together, a casual conversation about deadlines and next week's schedule threading between us. Yet beneath the words there was a subtle rhythm, a quiet exchange that carried meaning beyond sentences. Our shoulders brushed lightly, and the contact was electric in its softness. I could feel her warmth, the subtle fragrance of her perfume mingling with the cool evening air drifting through the window. It was ordinary, and yet extraordinary all at once. At the threshold, she paused, turning slightly to face me. The streetlights outside had begun to flicker on, bathing the hallway in a soft glow. Her eyes met mine, steady, searching, carrying a depth that neither of us had fully articulated before. "You handled today well," she said, voice soft, almost intimate. There was a pause, a beat that stretched longer than necessary, yet perfectly timed, where the world seemed to narrow to just the two of us. I smiled, sensing the weight behind her words, and replied honestly. "I couldn't have done it without your guidance." It was true professionally, but emotionally, it carried more, gratitude, recognition, and a quiet acknowledgement of the connection we had forged. She returned the smile, and in that moment, I felt a subtle shift, a bridge built from trust, warmth, and mutual understanding. A soft breeze drifted through the slightly open window, brushing her hair against her cheek. Instinctively, I reached out, tucking a stray strand behind her ear. She didn't pull away. Instead, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her fingers brushing lightly against mine. It was simple, safe, YouTube-friendly, but in its simplicity, it carried everything we hadn't yet said. Her warmth, her steady gaze, the closeness of our bodies in that tiny space, they all combined into a quiet, tender intimacy that felt profoundly complete. We lingered a moment longer, talking about mundane things, yet each word was wrapped in softness, each glance heavy with meaning. No grand gestures were needed. The connection was in the small touches, the lingering smiles, the unspoken understanding. There was no rush, no urgency, just the slow, deliberate unfolding of a bond that had grown through shared moments, gentle touches, and heartfelt honesty. Finally, we stepped out of the office together, the night air cool against our skin. I could feel her presence beside me, steady and grounding, and I realized that what we shared had reached a quiet fulfillment. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't explosive, but it was real, an age gap, slow burn connection built on trust, respect, and subtle affection. As we walked side by side under the street lights, I understood that this was just the beginning, yet in this moment, it felt complete. Our eyes met one last time before parting for the evening, a soft smile exchanged, an acknowledgement of what had been shared and what lay ahead. The story had found its warm resolution, not in grand declarations, but in quiet, enduring closeness that promised a deep, lasting connection. 12.